In the late summer of 2016, when the Cascade Range was moving from peak hiking season toward its quieter shoulder months, Lena Moore and Daniel Pike set out on what was meant to be an ordinary backcountry hike, the kind taken by people who trusted maps, weather forecasts, and each other. Lena was 29, Daniel 32, both experienced enough to feel confident, but not so seasoned that risk felt routine. And they were joined at the trailhead by Lena's stepsister, Erin Moore, who had proposed the trip weeks earlier and described it as a chance to reconnect, to spend a few days away from phones and unresolved family tensions. The plan was simple: 3 days on a lightly trafficked route known for old mining remnants and deep forest cover, camp near an alpine basin, then loop back. But simplicity in hindsight often masks the small decisions that later become fault lines. Witnesses at the trailhead remembered the three of them as unremarkable, friendly, organized, their gear appropriate, their mood calm, and when Erin returned alone 2 days later, sunburned, shaken, and claiming that Lena and Daniel had separated from her near a ridge after an argument about navigation, the initial response was concern rather than suspicion. Search and rescue teams mobilized quickly, sweeping the area where Erin said she last saw them, helicopters tracing tree lines and ravines, volunteers scouring switchbacks and creek beds, while Erin positioned herself at the center of the effort, speaking to reporters, organizing online groups, posting maps and timelines, and repeating the same details with consistent urgency. For 5 months, she remained the public face of the search, sleeping little, answering questions tirelessly, and correcting anyone who suggested alternative scenarios, insisting Lena would never leave the trail voluntarily and Daniel would never abandon her, statements that sounded reasonable and earned sympathy. As weeks turned into months with no trace, no gear, no footprints, no confirmed sightings, the narrative shifted from rescue to recovery, and with it came the quiet realization that the Cascades, with their dense forest, unstable ground, and remnants of forgotten industry, could hide almost anything indefinitely. It was during this period that small inconsistencies began to surface, not dramatic contradictions, but subtle variations in Erin's account, differences in timing, shifts in tone when describing the argument, occasional confusion about landmarks that someone as familiar with the area as she claimed to be should have known, details that were initially dismissed as trauma but later cataloged carefully. The search officially scaled back after 6 months, though Erin continued independently, raising funds, traveling to nearby towns to post flyers, and maintaining a steady online presence that framed the disappearance as a tragic accident waiting to be solved. Then, abruptly, that presence stopped. Her accounts went silent. Calls went unanswered, and when investigators attempted to contact her for a routine follow-up interview, they discovered she had crossed into Mexico using cash and secondary identification, a move she would later extend to Cuba, leaving behind no forwarding address and no explanation. This sudden disappearance reframed everything that came before it, prompting authorities to re-examine early assumptions and widen the scope of the investigation, not just into where Lena and Daniel might be, but into the dynamics of that final hike and the relationships behind it. Attention returned to the terrain itself, particularly to abandoned mine sites marked on outdated maps but rarely inspected, vertical shafts concealed by brush and time, places where a fall could leave no surface evidence and where sound would not carry. In 2020, nearly 4 years after the hike, a survey team mapping unstable ground near a decommissioned mining corridor detected an anomaly beneath collapsed timbers, and when responders lowered equipment into the shaft, they found remains consistent with 2 adults, along with fragments of hiking gear that matched the descriptions provided years earlier. The discovery confirmed death, but not cause. accident still plausible, yet the timing of Aaron's flight and the resurfacing of overlooked evidence, messages, financial records, a second suspect quietly questioned and later arrested in January 2020, suggested the truth was not buried by the mountain alone. Instead, it pointed back to the starting point of the story, to a hike framed as reconciliation, to a stepsister who searched too hard and then vanished, and to a chain of decisions that began long before anyone stepped onto the trail, setting into motion an ending that would take years to surface and even longer to understand. After the remains were recovered from the abandoned mine shaft, the investigation reopened with a focus that had been absent during the early search years, shifting from terrain-driven explanations to human behavior. And this shift forced investigators to reconstruct not just the final hike, but the months leading up to it, where motive, tension, and opportunity quietly formed. Interviews with friends and co-workers revealed that Lena Moore's decision to go on the trip had been hesitant, framed less as adventure and more as obligation, a compromise made to repair a strained relationship with Aaron, whose presence in Lena's life had grown increasingly unpredictable after the death of their shared parent. Messages exchanged between the sisters showed warmth on the surface but strain underneath, with Aaron frequently pushing for closeness and Lena responding cautiously, often delaying plans or redirecting conversations, suggesting a dynamic where boundaries were uneven and resentment unspoken. Daniel Pike, protective by nature, had expressed concerns privately about the hike, questioning why Aaron insisted on a remote route rather than a popular trail, but ultimately agreed to go, believing his presence would keep things stable. This context reshaped the argument Aaron claimed had occurred on the ridge, making it less an isolated disagreement and more the continuation of unresolved tension. When investigators reviewed Aaron's original statements with this in mind, they noticed how often she positioned herself as the mediator, the reasonable party trying to keep the peace, a framing that now felt strategic rather than incidental. The physical evidence from the mine shaft deepened suspicion further, as the shaft was not on the marked loop trail Aaron had described, requiring a deliberate detour that contradicted her account of being separated accidentally. Mapping software showed that reaching the shaft involved navigating through dense undergrowth and around warning markers, a path unlikely to be taken unknowingly, especially by two hikers unfamiliar with mining remnants. Attention then turned to a man identified in early reports only as a peripheral figure, later revealed as Aaron Cole, a local with ties to the region's abandoned mines and a history of informal guiding and salvage work, who had been questioned briefly in 2016 after being seen near the trailhead, but released due to lack of evidence. Phone records obtained years later placed Aaron in contact with Aaron in the weeks before the hike, a connection she had failed to disclose, and financial analysis revealed a series of cash withdrawals and transfers that suggested planning rather than coincidence. Investigators theorized that Aaron may have arranged a meeting under the guise of a hike, leveraging her familiarity with Lena's habits and Daniel's trust to bring them into proximity with someone who knew the terrain intimately. When Aaron vanished into Mexico and then Cuba, her flight took on new meaning, no longer a reaction to grief, but potentially an attempt to evade scrutiny as these connections surfaced. Aaron Cole was arrested in January 2020 after authorities linked him to tools and materials found near the shaft that matched items from his workshop. Evidence circumstantial but compelling when combined with witness testimony placing his vehicle on an access road near the site on the day of the disappearance. Still, the absence of Aaron complicated prosecution, leaving investigators to build a case around inference, timeline, and behavior rather than direct confession. For those involved, the reopened case was unsettling, forcing a reckoning with how quickly trust can be weaponized and how easily early narratives can shape and distort the course of an investigation. What had once seemed like a tragic hiking accident now appeared as a carefully orchestrated convergence of relationships, secrecy, and geography, with the mineshaft serving not as a random hazard, but as a chosen endpoint, hidden in plain sight, waiting quietly for the truth to catch up. As the investigation moved into its third phase, the challenge was no longer discovering what had happened in the Cascade Range, but proving how much of it had been planned in advance and by whom, and this meant disentangling coincidence from coordination with a level of precision the early search had never required. Forensic analysts reconstructed Lena Moore and Daniel Pike's final day using a mosaic of indirect evidence: parking lot cameras miles away, fuel purchases in a neighboring town, weather data, and fragments of digital communication recovered from cloud backups. And what emerged was a timeline that conflicted sharply with Aaron Moore's original account. According to Aaron, the group separated shortly after midday following a disagreement, yet satellite imagery and time-stamped photographs showed the trio together well into the afternoon, moving steadily off the loop trail and toward an area dense with historical mining activity. The deviation was subtle, the kind hikers might follow if guided or reassured by someone claiming local knowledge, and investigators now believed Aaron had encouraged this turn, presenting it as a shortcut or scenic detour. Daniel's phone data showed intermittent signal loss consistent with descending terrain, and a partially recorded voice memo, likely captured accidentally, preserved fragments of conversation: Lena questioning the route, Daniel urging caution, and Aaron responding with a tone that was firm but calming, suggesting authority rather than uncertainty. The recording cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that became one of the case's most unsettling artifacts. Attention returned to Aaron Cole, whose familiarity with abandoned mine sites made him an essential link in understanding how Lena and Daniel ended up in a shaft concealed by years of neglect. And interviews with locals painted a picture of someone who knew which locations were unstable, which were accessible, and which were rarely visited, knowledge that could be used for work or, in a darker context, concealment. Investigators found that Aaron had been paid in cash shortly before the hike, a sum matching withdrawals made by Aaron, and that his phone pinged near an old service road that intersected the detour path on the same afternoon the trio disappeared. Though he denied meeting them that day, the convergence of data suggested otherwise, raising the possibility that Aaron's role was not merely to mislead, but to deliver Lena and Daniel to a prearranged location. Motive remained murky, but increasingly personal, as financial records showed long-standing disputes between Aaron and Lena over inheritance and debt, arguments that had intensified in the months before the hike, and messages hinted at Aaron's belief that Lena had withheld support, a grievance that blurred emotional resentment with perceived entitlement. Daniel, though not directly involved in those conflicts, was seen by investigators as collateral, someone whose presence complicated the plan, but whose trust made the setup viable. The mine shaft itself offered grim confirmation of intent, as structural analysis indicated that the covering timbers had been disturbed around the time of the incident, suggesting the opening had been deliberately obscured rather than left exposed, a finding inconsistent with accidental fall theories. As pressure mounted, Aaron's disappearance became a central obstacle, her movements tracked only through financial footprints and travel records, each confirming her intent to remain beyond reach, and her silence stood in contrast to her earlier urgency, a reversal that spoke louder than any statement. Prosecutors prepared for a case built on circumstantial evidence, aware that without Aaron present, assigning responsibility would rely on demonstrating coordinated action rather than singular guilt. What had begun as a search for lost hikers was now a methodical examination of how trust can be manipulated, how familiarity can lower defenses, and how environments known for their beauty can be used to mask deliberate harm. A transformation that forced everyone involved to reconsider the thin line between accident and design. As prosecutors prepared their case, the investigation entered a phase defined by pressure rather than discovery, with each new detail tested not only for plausibility, but for how it would withstand scrutiny in court. And this required narrowing the narrative to moments that could be demonstrated rather than inferred. Attention centered on the hour-long window between the last confirmed image of the trio together and the time Daniel Pike's phone went permanently offline, a span that now appeared critical because it was during this period that Erin Moore's account diverged most sharply from the data. She had claimed she left Lena and Daniel near a ridge and continued alone, yet tracking analysis showed no evidence of her returning to the main trail at that point, while environmental experts testified that moving solo through that terrain would have been slow and hazardous, inconsistent with her reported pace. This discrepancy suggested that Erin remained with them longer than she admitted, a fact that, if proven, would place her at or near the mine site during the crucial moments. Further analysis of the voice memo recovered from Daniel's phone revealed background noise consistent with loose timber and metal contact, sounds that aligned more closely with a mine entrance than with open forest, strengthening the argument that the group had already reached the hazardous area when the recording ended. Investigators also revisited the early search maps and noted that Erin had repeatedly steered volunteers away from the mining corridor, emphasizing steep ravines and water crossings instead, a choice that once seemed logical but now appeared selective. Witnesses from the search effort recalled her discouraging exploration of dangerous old sites, framing it as concern for safety, a stance that conveniently delayed discovery of the shaft for years. Financial motives came into sharper focus as forensic accountants traced insurance policies and inheritance documents, revealing that Erin stood to benefit significantly from Lena's death, gains that were not immediate but would materialize over time, a fact that aligned with the slow, indirect nature of the plan investigators believed had unfolded. Erin Cole's involvement was framed less as mastermind and more as facilitator, someone whose knowledge of the mines could be leveraged for concealment, and under questioning he acknowledged knowing Erin socially but continued to deny meeting her in 2016, a denial undermined by surveillance footage showing his truck near a border town the same week Erin crossed into Mexico. This convergence suggested coordination beyond chance, hinting that Erin's escape may have been assisted or at least anticipated. Still, the lack of direct eyewitnesses left gaps the defense was quick to exploit, arguing that the environment itself could explain every irregularity, that memory distortion accounted for Erin's inconsistencies, and that financial connections proved nothing without proof of intent. Prosecutors countered by emphasizing pattern over incident, showing how each choice, route selection, communication omissions, misdirection of search efforts, and flight from jurisdiction fit together into a coherent sequence. As pretrial motions progressed, the case became less about reconstructing a fall and more about exposing a narrative that had been carefully managed from the outset, one in which Erin's role as grieving sister shielded her from early scrutiny and allowed crucial time to pass. The public, once sympathetic, began to reassess her actions, and the story shifted from tragic disappearance to suspected betrayal, a transformation that was unsettling precisely because it challenged assumptions about who can be trusted in moments of crisis. Through it all, Lena and Daniel's voices remained largely absent, preserved only in fragments of data and second-hand recollections, a reminder that while legal arguments turned on motive and opportunity, the human cost of the case lay in lives cut short and in a truth that emerged slowly, resisted fiercely, and even now remained partially obscured by the very relationships that had set it in motion. By the time the case reached trial preparation, the narrative had hardened into two competing interpretations, each built from the same fragments but assembled with different intent, and the task before prosecutors was to demonstrate that what appeared circumstantial was in fact cumulative, that no single detail proved guilt, but together they formed a pattern too deliberate to dismiss. Central to this effort was reframing Aaron Moore's early visibility during the search not as evidence of innocence, but as an opportunity to shape perception, and investigators compiled a detailed timeline of her public statements, noting how certain phrases repeated while others evolved, especially when discussing the route taken and the argument that allegedly preceded the separation. Linguistic analysts testified that her language shifted subtly once attention moved toward abandoned mines, becoming more abstract and less precise, a change they argued was consistent with avoidance rather than trauma. The prosecution also leaned heavily on the digital footprint recovered from Lena's phone backups, including unsent messages that suggested apprehension about Aaron's insistence on continuing the hike despite fatigue and misgivings. And while these messages did not accuse Aaron directly, they undermined the portrayal of the hike as spontaneous and harmonious. Daniel Pike's communications, too, were re-examined, particularly a message sent to a friend the night before the trip, expressing concern that this isn't just about hiking, a line that prosecutors framed as forewarning, though the defense argued it was meaningless without context. Aaron Cole's role became clearer as investigators presented evidence that he had visited the mine site in the weeks leading up to the hike, likely assessing its accessibility and stability, activity that he claimed was routine, but which prosecutors argued demonstrated preparation. Tools recovered near the shaft were shown to match wear patterns consistent with his equipment, suggesting recent disturbance, and while this did not prove he caused the deaths, it supported the theory that the site had been intentionally used. Aaron's flight remained the most emotionally compelling element of the case, and prosecutors introduced travel records showing that her departure coincided precisely with the point when investigators requested a second, more detailed interview, arguing that this timing was incompatible with grief-driven escape. The defense countered by suggesting fear of wrongful accusation and media pressure, but the prosecution emphasized that Aaron had not attempted to clear her name or maintain contact, instead choosing routes that complicated extradition. As these arguments unfolded, public reaction intensified, divided between those who saw the case as a tragic accident exploited by hindsight and those who believed it revealed a calculated betrayal masked by empathy. For the families of Lena and Daniel, the process was exhausting, forcing them to revisit painful details while still lacking definitive answers. Yet many expressed a sense of relief that the story was finally being examined in full rather than reduced to a mystery of terrain. Expert witnesses testified about decision-making under social pressure, explaining how people can be guided toward risk by trusted figures without recognizing the danger until escape is impossible, a framework that helped jurors understand how Lena and Daniel might have followed Aaron off the trail without immediate resistance. As the trial approached, the absence of Aaron loomed over every proceeding, her silence functioning as both shield and accusation. And while legal standards required proof beyond reasonable doubt, the accumulation of evidence painted a picture of intent that was increasingly difficult to ignore, suggesting that the hike had not been a momentary lapse or misadventure, but the final act of a plan shaped by resentment, opportunity, and the calculated use of isolation to erase witnesses. As the trial date approached, the absence of Aaron Moore reshaped the entire legal strategy, forcing prosecutors to construct a case that treated her not as a missing defendant, but as an active presence defined by patterns of behavior rather than testimony. And this required demonstrating that her disappearance was not a break in the story, but its continuation. Investigators presented a chronological analysis of her movements after the search officially slowed, showing how her online activity diminished gradually rather than abruptly. Donations redirected, volunteer coordination handed off without explanation, and public statements softened into vague expressions of hope before stopping entirely, a withdrawal that mirrored the way she had controlled information earlier. Travel records showed she crossed into Mexico using overland routes common among those avoiding attention, then remained mobile before entering Cuba, a country without an extradition treaty at the time. And prosecutors argued that this sequence reflected foresight rather than panic. The defense objected to framing flight as guilt, but the prosecution countered by tying Aaron's departure to specific investigative milestones, particularly the moment when authorities began asking about her financial ties to Aaron Cole and her familiarity with abandoned mine sites. Attention returned to Cole, whose January 2020 arrest marked the first tangible legal consequence in the case. And while he continued to deny direct involvement in the deaths, his statements grew inconsistent under pressure, especially regarding his whereabouts on the day of the hike and his communications with Aaron. Phone data placed him within a narrow radius of the mine shaft during the critical window, and witnesses testified to seeing his truck parked along an access road rarely used by hikers, testimony that undermined his claim of unrelated work. Forensic specialists also testified that the shaft's covering appeared to have been adjusted shortly before the incident, not freshly constructed but repositioned, enough to conceal depth without fully sealing the opening, a condition that would allow someone unfamiliar to step forward without realizing the danger until too late. Prosecutors argued that this configuration suggested intent to obscure rather than prevent access, aligning with a plan that relied on misdirection rather than force. Defense attorneys pushed back, emphasizing the lack of direct evidence of violence and the impossibility of proving coordination without Aaron present. But the prosecution reframed the absence itself as a behavioral marker, pointing out that Aaron had ample opportunity to cooperate, to clarify misunderstandings, or to contest the narrative, yet chose instead to remain unreachable. Throughout these proceedings, Lena Moore and Daniel Pike were reconstructed as individuals rather than abstractions, their habits, communication styles, and decision-making patterns laid out to show how trust operated in their relationships, and how Aaron's role as family lowered defenses that would have otherwise remained intact. Expert testimony on familial coercion highlighted how obligations framed as reconciliation can override personal hesitation, especially when paired with isolation and time pressure, a dynamic that helped explain why Lena and Daniel continued forward even as uncertainty mounted. As motions concluded and jury selection began, the case stood at a difficult threshold. Legally incomplete, yet narratively coherent, built not on a single dramatic act, but on a series of aligned decisions that funneled two people toward a place where survival depended on information they did not have. The prosecution's final pretrial filing summarized this position plainly, arguing that Lena and Daniel did not simply get lost or fall, but were guided into a situation where the margin for error was intentionally narrowed, and that responsibility lay not only with the man arrested in 2020, but with the woman who had initiated the journey and then disappeared when scrutiny closed in. Whether the court would accept this construction remained uncertain, but by this stage the case had moved beyond speculation, standing instead as a documented examination of how trust, opportunity, and calculated silence can converge into irreversible harm. The trial unfolded with a restrained intensity, less dramatic than the public had imagined, but heavier in its implications, as the prosecution focused on methodically linking choices rather than provoking emotional reactions, aware that without Aaron Moore in custody, the case against Aaron Cole would rise or fall on whether the jury accepted coordination over coincidence. Opening statements emphasized that this was not a case of sudden violence, but of gradual steering, a sequence of decisions that narrowed Lena Moore and Daniel Pike's options until the environment itself became the instrument of harm. Witnesses from the original search took the stand first, many expressing lingering unease about how certain areas had been deprioritized early on, and several testified that Aaron's confidence and insistence had influenced those decisions more than official guidance, an admission that reframed early missteps as manipulated outcomes rather than simple error. Digital analysts then walked jurors through reconstructed maps showing the hikers' final movements layered against known mine locations, illustrating how the chosen detour intersected almost precisely with the shaft where the camper van would later be found, a convergence that the prosecution argued could not be accidental. Aaron Cole's defense centered on the idea that his knowledge of the terrain was being misinterpreted, that familiarity did not equal intent, and that his presence in the area was consistent with his work history. Yet, under cross-examination, his explanations shifted subtly, particularly when asked why he had failed to mention certain visits or communications until confronted with records. One of the most significant moments came when prosecutors introduced testimony from a border security expert who explained how certain travel patterns, including Aaron's route and timing, were characteristic of deliberate evasion rather than spontaneous departure, a framing that, while not directly implicating Aaron, reinforced the narrative of a coordinated plan. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing prejudice and speculation, but the judge allowed the testimony, instructing jurors to consider it only as context. Emotional weight entered the courtroom through victim impact statements, not in the form of accusation, but remembrance, as family members described Lena and Daniel's trust in Aaron and their belief that the hike was meant to repair strained relationships, a detail that underscored how the plan, if accepted, relied on emotional leverage rather than physical force. Expert witnesses on environmental hazards testified that experienced hikers often underestimate man-made dangers in wilderness areas, especially abandoned infrastructure, a fact that lent plausibility to how Lena and Daniel could have approached the shaft without recognizing its depth. As closing arguments neared, the prosecution returned to its central thesis, that Aaron Cole did not act alone, but he did act knowingly, using his expertise to assist in a situation where two people were placed at lethal risk without informed consent. The defense countered that the state was asking the jury to punish association rather than action, to fill gaps with inference, and to convict a man largely because a woman had fled, an argument that resonated with some observers. Yet as jurors retired to deliberate, the case had already accomplished something beyond verdict, shifting the public understanding of the disappearance from a cautionary tale about wilderness danger to a study of how human intention can exploit those dangers. Whether or not the jury would find Aaron Cole legally responsible, the narrative of Lena and Daniel's final hike had been irrevocably altered, no longer framed as misfortune, but as the endpoint of a chain of decisions that began long before they ever set foot on the trail. By the 8th year since Lena Moore and Daniel Pike vanished in the Cascade Range, the story had evolved beyond headlines and news cycles, settling into a complex mixture of legal precedent, public fascination, and lingering human grief. The mine shaft where their remains had been discovered had become both a symbol and a silent witness, an unyielding reminder that some truths are only revealed when circumstance, timing, and human action intersect in irreversible ways. Investigators and legal analysts continued to revisit the case, not because new physical evidence had emerged, but because the interplay of human behavior, manipulation, and environment demanded reflection. It had become a study of how trust can be weaponized, how loyalty can be leveraged, and how the natural world, indifferent and silent, can amplify human choices to deadly effect. Erin Moore remained beyond reach, her movements following a trajectory that had spanned Mexico and Cuba, each step calculated to evade scrutiny, a living ghost that framed the narrative even as her absence complicated prosecution. Her initial role as the grieving stepsister had allowed her to guide both the search effort and public perception, positioning herself as the embodiment of concern while controlling access to key locations and information. Now, removed from immediate influence, her earlier actions were reinterpreted as premeditated, a pattern of subtle coercion that had contributed to Lena and Daniel's final path. Analysts noted that her flight, rather than weakening suspicion, magnified it, and in legal circles, her absence was treated as an essential behavioral data point, a deliberate choice to avoid accountability that aligned with other actions and decisions leading up to the tragedy. Erin Cole, meanwhile, faced trial with a narrative heavily dependent on circumstantial evidence, reconstructed timelines, and behavioral inference. While he denied wrongdoing, the prosecution argued that his expertise with abandoned mining infrastructure and knowledge of remote terrain had been exploited in a sequence that funneled the couple toward danger. The mine shaft, covered and partially concealed, became the most compelling piece of evidence, its configuration inconsistent with simple accident. The covering timbers showed signs of recent movement and subtle adjustments, indicating a level of manipulation sufficient to render the area hazardous without raising immediate alarm to those unfamiliar with the site. Expert testimony underscored that even seasoned hikers could fail to recognize these risks, especially when guided by someone they trusted. The trial's courtroom proceedings highlighted the extraordinary ways ordinary relationships can enable harm. Testimonies explored familial dynamics, social influence, and decision-making under pressure, illustrating that Lena and Daniel's choices on that fateful hike were not purely autonomous, but shaped by trust, obligation, and subtle coercion. The prosecution emphasized that the combination of these factors created an environment in which mistakes, misjudgments, or deliberate misdirection could become fatal. The defense, conversely, argued that the complexity of the terrain, environmental hazards, and the unpredictability of human behavior made it impossible to assign direct responsibility for the deaths, pointing to the absence of Erin Moore as a critical gap that prevented a complete understanding of intent. Outside the courtroom, public fascination persisted, fueled by podcasts, online forums, and documentaries exploring the case as a cautionary tale. Analysts dissected the trajectory of the hike, Erin's influence, and Erin Cole's knowledge, debating the boundaries between negligence, manipulation, and intentional harm. Commentators emphasized the psychological mechanisms at play, how trust can be exploited, how familiarity can lower defenses, and how emotional leverage often outweighs rational assessment in moments of perceived obligation. The story became less about legal outcomes and more about the fragility of human connection, the consequences of decisions made under social pressure, and the sobering reality that even well-intentioned individuals can be guided toward situations with lethal consequences. For the families of Lena and Daniel, the case remained both a source of grief and a search for understanding. Each court proceeding, each revelation, reshaped their perception of the final hike, from tragic misadventure to a sequence of orchestrated events involving subtle influence, opportunity, and manipulation. While legal closure remained incomplete without Erin Moore, the narrative that had emerged allowed them to contextualize the tragedy, to see the interplay of choice, trust, and circumstance that had determined the outcome. The mine shaft, inaccessible to most, stood as a stark, silent testament to the fatal intersection of human intention and environmental hazards. By the end of this phase, the story had moved beyond mystery into a study of consequence, revealing uncomfortable truths about human behavior, responsibility, and the ease with which ordinary relationships can conceal extraordinary risk. Lena and Daniel's disappearance was no longer framed as an accident, but as the tragic endpoint of a series of decisions, pressures, and misjudgments, an ending shaped as much by people as by place, and remembered as a cautionary tale that emphasized the dangers of trust, the weight of influence, and the unforgiving consequences that can emerge when human decisions intersect with nature's indifference. It was a story that left its audience unsettled, not because it was unresolved in the traditional sense, but because it highlighted the subtle and pervasive ways in which lives can be directed toward irreversible harm, and how sometimes even those who survive the immediate danger are forever marked by the roles they played in shaping it.